Hi, today I'll try to get the hang of paper negatives using a well-known photographic paper, Ilford Multigrade IV RC for resin coated. We'll see how to get those results here with a basic 35mm film camera and a cutout template for the paper. Obviously, when I say results, I mean failures mainly, and a few lucky strikes eventually when all is calibrated. This is the camera I'll use, a Minolta X300, nothing fancy, for which I prepared a cutout template that goes into place, like so. Obviously we are in the dark room under red safe light to avoid fogging the paper. Most print papers are not sensitive to low level of red light. This one follows the same rule, hence the red light and the poor image quality of this dark room video clip. Back to our paper, I'm making sure I put the paper the right way around, emulsion side down in my case. I made a notch on the bottom left corner of my cutout template, so once the paper is cut to size, I can immediately recognize which way around I should put it in the camera. Because once I'm outside the dark room, the only way to advance the film, or change the paper negative, I should say, will be in a changing bag, or a dark bag, where I won't be able to see anything. I forgot to mention that the term paper negative refers to placing print paper or photographic paper in the camera exactly where the film would go. Okay, now the paper is properly cut to size. We can easily see the sheen of the emulsion side here. Obviously the emulsion side should face the lens, so here again it's facing down. Closing the camera isn't a problem at all because the paper thickness is within the tolerance of the pressure plate springs, for this camera at least. In total darkness this would be as easy as that because I just need to place the notch on the bottom left corner. Okay, now I'm ready to do my first exposure test. The whole idea of what I'm doing today is to determine a workable exposure index for that paper. Once I have this piece of the exposure puzzle, I'll be in a better place to think about doing some real work with it. But for now, I'll be satisfied with some mid-tones details. So not knowing where to start and the internet forums or fora being as reliable as we all know, I'm making a bold first try at an exposure index of 50. Yes, 50, basically meaning I'll shoot the paper negative as if it had an ISO of 50. This gives me half a second at f2.8 and a tenth. So for all practical purposes 2.8 and a tenth is 2.8. So I set my aperture at 2.8 and my shutter speed at half a second. And now let me introduce you to my most handy model. Okay, why the hand? Well, because these are the kind of upper mid-tones I'd like to have details in. It's as simple as that. Also, I'll know where the white tone stands because of the adequately chosen background. Yeah, I managed to fire 1 or 2 brain cells on that. Now let us develop this precious baby. I can open the camera under red safe light, something that cannot be done with a regular film emulsion, as we all know. And I just put it in the developer tray with some adequate agitation. We'll talk about paper processing another time. For now, let us assume it's easy. It's actually not far from it. Yay! Something! We have something! Fake! How fake is that? I mean, I was excited. I mean, really. I mean, the feeling was more like, yay! That was the feeling. Let us get back on track. I'll call that a success anyway. Remember, this is my first paper negative development like ever. So at the time, I was quite excited. Well, okay, it's not quite what I wanted, but at least I have a silhouette. So the handy hand needs a bit more light, quite a bit more actually. So the next frame is going to be shot at an exposure index of 12. 50 to 12 is 2 more stops of light, which gives me 1 second at f2.8 and 4/10. Yes, the light has changed. A second measure to make sure. Yes, 28.4. And now with the bulb out, we have 28.6, meaning we have a low contrast light. 0.4 to 0.6 is 2/10 of a stop of a difference. I'm close to the axis of the light, so it doesn't change much anyway. The light is fairly constant now, no clouds moving in or out. So let's go for an exposure of 1 second at 2.8.5, which is close enough to 0.4. So I set the aperture at f2.8.5 with a shutter speed of 1 second, if I manage to find it. Voila, 1 second. Heard that shutter? Obviously this is going to be another blurry hand picture. And now my second paper negative development ever. Okay, not bad, but not enough. Now I have a problem. The ambient light in the studio is even lower thanks to a big bad cloud, and my camera shutter maxes out at 1 second. I cannot expose for a longer time. And bulb mode is not accurate enough for my calibration. So what do? Well, flash we do. We have to resort to artificial light. I'll spare you the hassle and show you the result instead. This video is already long enough and my weird speech flow must have worn you out by now. So this is our first result at an exposure index of 50. We can see the obvious problem. My white background is not black at all, and the hand is a silhouette. So I gave it 2 more stops and exposed at EI 12. Much better, we are getting there. The background is closer to its tonality, but not quite there yet. So again, I gave it 2 more stops of exposure under strobe light, and we have a much better negative at an exposure index of 3. Let's take a closer look. Top left is EI 50, our first one. Top right is our second one at EI 12. We can start to distinguish some mid-tones in the hand, but it's a bit light for a negative. And the bottom one is our final test at EI 3. So it took me 3 exposures to nail it, not a single more. Obviously I'm not looking for complete zone system mastery kind of standard here in the short test, but a reasonable ballpark kind of standard. Also remember it's a multigrade paper, so the color of the light will affect its contrast noticeably. But again, I'm not going to look into that just now, as I intend to shoot in constant conditions of light for the time being. So now let's see how to print the last negative, the one exposed at EI 3. I'm choosing to do it the calotype way, although this is a misnomer. More clearly I'm going to contact print it. To do so I take an unexposed leftover piece of print paper to make a strip test. We'll see what that is in a second. It's the same paper I used to make the negative. I cut it roughly to the size of the negative I want to print, and I put the rest back in the box. Print paper leftovers are quite useful, so I tend to keep my leftovers. Then I identify the emulsion side. It's easy, it's the shiny side. I put the emulsion side of the negative and the print paper face to face. Then I make sure the negative sits on the top of the sandwich, so that when I'll expose it to the light will go first through the back of the paper negative, get across the paper negative thickness, then through the negative emulsion where only the non-dark areas will let it go through, then eventually onto the light sensitive emulsion of the print paper that we will need to develop. So not knowing the proper exposure time, we need to test it, and I will do it with a test strip. Again, I'll go back to that in more detail in another video, or there are other videos on the internet anyways, so I'm not sure I'm going to do one. So the first strip test I do is a bit too light, so I decide to make a second one with 3 exposures, one at 30 seconds, one at 20 seconds, and one at 10 seconds. This clearly looks much better. Again, I don't play with the paper contrast with contrast filters here. So this is just plain contact printing, nothing more. So now I can contact print my negative for real using the same sandwich technique. Emulsion sides face to face, negative on the top. And to make sure both are in perfect contact, I just put a plain sheet of glass over the sandwich, and then I expose for 25 seconds. One remark, I should not touch the sheet of glass to avoid messing with the registration while the exposure is going on. But yet again, I'm not making hard here, just calibrating my medium. Well, I'm not really satisfied with details at 25 seconds, so I make another one at 30 seconds. And now we are looking at the results with a complete picture of the calibration process. So this was our first negative at EI 50, then the second one at EI 12, which is much better, and the final one at EI 3 under strobe light. On the positive side, this is our first test strip, exposure test strip I should say, which is much too light. I didn't expect the paper to suck this much light, but anyway I did run a second test strip here at 10, 20 and 30 second exposure. This is my first real positive contact printed at 25 seconds, and then this is my final positive contact printed at 30 seconds. So it's not too bad for a first try. I didn't go back and forth too many times here. We can see it more clearly here, negative on top, positive on the bottom. Don't call me a pessimist. So my left hand reclaimed this left attitude in the positive with some reasonable detail in the palm. Okay, rough calibration done. Now let's do some further testing outside to evaluate real light exposure and the practicality of using this setup on the go. Now a few points about practicality. Here I just arrived from the outside world and I'm opening the changing bag to get my negatives. As you can see, I have a smaller bag inside, and a dark envelope will do. This is where my negatives are staying. In broad daylight it's necessary because I need to open the changing bag to put the camera in it so I can change the negative. Without these two bags, I would need to go back in the dark room every time to change my paper negative after each frame. Another important thing to grasp is the sensitivity of the paper is far from being useless. On the contrary, it's actually quite fast. In broad daylight we have f22 at half a second, so for longer exposure times you will need to add a neutral density filter or play with a pinhole camera, as for those the aperture is very small. On the other end, half a second at f22 is equal to 1/60th of a second at f4, which allows for relatively fast work. Here's my outing harvest. Let's develop it. Again, this is not work, I'm just finalizing my calibration by a field test. And when you make mistakes here, well, it hurts a lot. Forgetting to adjust the shutter speed or knocking a setting off without noticing it is a massive pain. Indeed, for each frame you need to retrieve the dark bag from your shoulder bag, open it carefully, put the camera in it, closing it. Each and every time it's two zips that you have to manipulate for a dark bag opening or closing. Then you have to put your hands in it, look for the paper negatives that are not exposed yet. So by the way, they have to be properly separated from the already exposed ones. Then you have to put it in the camera. It's easy to do with the notch made on the paper. Then again, close the camera, open the dark bag, close the dark bag, put it back in your shoulder bag, etc., etc. This is very manually intensive. It's very close to large format work in this regard. But it's only for a 35mm frame. It's crazy. So fat fingering got me to go out a second time. And these are the results of the outside world test. These are all negatives. The two on the top left are exposed respectively for the shadows and the highlight under hard light. This one is exposed for the highlights in hard light 2, which is 1/60th of a second at f4 in broad daylight with an exposure index of 3, or ISO 3 if you will. Another exposure under shadows in hard light, I mean direct sunlight. Bottom left is flat light, so shadow light on a dark building. And the last two are hard light exposed on the highlights. The two first ones are very characteristic. Exposing paper negative is relatively similar to exposing slides. It needs to be exposed for the highlights to retain some details in the whites. There's a good example here with the frame shot against the light exposed for the shadows. The foreground in full sunlight is totally gone. We are not talking film emulsion kind of dynamic here. I'll contact print a few to have a better idea. Here are some typical results from this session. Negatives are in column 1 and 3, positives are in column 2 and 4. On a practical note again, the top one is interesting. We can see stains on the negative and therefore on the positive. These stains are coming from my fingers' sweat, staining the paper while manipulating it in the dark bag. For those who have never played with a dark bag in full sun, I can tell you it's getting dripping wet inside very quickly. We can see the stains on the negative here. So the positive of the frame exposed for the highlights is way more pleasing, as it retains some details in the upper tones. The takeaway here for me is I need to find a way to manipulate the paper without touching its emulsion side, while not seeing it. Great, that would be fun! So the print paper Ilford Multigrade IV can be exposed at EI3, measured on the highlights. And this last one is a proof that a lot can be done with a paper negative. We have some details in the skin tones here, even if they are faint. It's a 35mm frame after all. Again, this is not work, just a test for which I have to thank these passing by young ladies. There you have it. If you want to play with paper negatives, you'll have a quicker start than mine now. Cheers, bye!